Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors NEHGS and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of America's history, looking at the story of three immigrant families over the last century and one tragic murder that affected all of them. On your screen is the schedule for our 75-minute event centered on the new book, Genealogy of a Murder, 4 Generations, 3 Families, 1 Fateful Night by Lisa Belkin. After some introductions, Ms. Belkin will present her story, these family stories, for 45 minutes. Then she'll be joined by tonight's moderator, genealogist Melanie McComb. They'll be in conversation for nearly a half hour, during which time they'll answer some of your questions. If you have a pressing query, do enter it into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and Melanie will surface all the questions that she can. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. Their video will be produced this very evening. The link to it is being put in the chat now and will be sent again to registered attendees when the video goes live on our website in the next 18 hours. This video is meant for those who registered and couldn't be with us tonight, or anyone who had technical difficulties over the next hour plus. Of course, the real enlightenment and enjoyment, real education on this topic, comes from reading the book itself. If you purchase the bundled ticket for this evening, a signed copy of Genealogy of a Murder will be shipped to you from our partners at Porter Square Books by February 15. If you signed up simply for this Zoom event and would like to order a signed copy, or you want to buy additional copies for friends and family, you can do that directly from the bookstore as supply lasts. Again, they have signed copies. That link again is being shared in the chat. Please input the code AMINS24 so they know that you deserve a signed copy and that you are with us tonight. You will want this book. The critics in the New York Times, journalists, and other authors are raving. It's riveting, majestically sweeping, exquisite, hauntingly powerful, a hell of a good read, reads like fiction. And all of us in-house here at NEHGS, American Ancestors, really, truly agree. I have finished the book, but many of us are still turning pages completely gripped. It is riveting. Now for some background on our author. Lisa Belkin is an award-winning journalist and the author of many narrative nonfiction books, including Show Me a Hero, which was made into an HBO miniseries by David Simon. Her career at the New York Times includes stints as a national correspondent, medical reporter, and contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. Our moderator, Melanie McComb, is a senior genealogist at American Ancestors NEHGS. She assists members and visitors with family history research. Also, occasionally, she helps out reporters with particularly tough challenges. Lisa Belkin consulted with her in April 2019, which is one of the many reasons we're here tonight. Melanie has a particular expertise in DNA and Atlantic Canada, Irish and Jewish genealogical research, and she lectures internationally on various topics. We'll hear from Melanie, as I said, in the last third of our program, but for now, welcome, Lisa. This is such a pleasure.
It is so good to be here. Thank you for all of that. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Melanie. I will thank you again later for helping me through a brick wall several years ago so this book could exist.
Well, we're just so grateful. I've been reading your words for many years, particularly in the New York Times Magazine, and at the New York Times, where you reported for 20 years, which is an amazing feat. You penned, as many of us know, some groundbreaking, buzzword-making stories on the cover of the magazine. In particular, Lisa, you are positively famous. And
Yes, I am. Yes,
you are. And you're especially famous now. What a pivot you've made. You're famous around my office these days for your new book, which is right up our alley. And as you know, we're all really excited that you're here with a book about genealogy. We're all eager to hear from you and then from Melanie. So welcome again, and over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. So I have some show and tell here, because one of the joys of doing a book like this about genealogy and ancestry and old archives is you come out with a lot of pictures and documents. So let's take a look at them. First, here's the cover of the book. Can you go back one sec? Do you see the people in the words? I love this cover because it sort of represents what the process was. You know, you take a look at it, you think it's words, then you look more closely and people are kind of looking at you, waiting to talk to you, or so it felt. And then gradually you come to see there is always more. There's always more when you keep looking. So that is why I love this particular cover. Okay, now to my mom and Al. So the story, which is at its root about the importance of stories, began meaningfully with a story. It was one that my stepfather told me exactly 10 years ago tomorrow morning, which I just realized earlier today. I was visiting my mom and her new husband in Arizona, their new home in Tucson, Arizona. Theirs was a new marriage at the time, a late in life one. He was near 90, she was almost 80, and they were reveling in this new, really unexpected chapter in their lives. And they were cooking their favorite Sunday meal of duck eggs and that he prepared, and special toast from the farmer's market. And my stepfather sat down and said, you know, your last book, which he had just read, the one David Simon made into a miniseries, he said, that reminds me of a story. And he proceeded to talk, and he talked for the next 45 minutes. And next slide, the story he told me, this was Al at the time, the story he told me was of a time decades earlier. So this was what he looked like as a man in his 30s, just out of medical school, a newly minted physician. He was drafted out of his residency into the army, and he was stationed, it was the Korean War and the Cold War, but he was stationed not in a war zone, but in a prison, the Stateville Penitentiary in Chicago, Illinois. And Stateville was the site of the Army's experiments to find a cure for malaria, which was a disease that had been decimating US troops since World War II through Korea. And now in 1958, as Al arrived, there was the looming specter of Southeast Asia. So Al's job was to experiment on prisoners, to give them malaria and then give them candidate medications to see which were more effective. We can debate the ethics of this. I do in the book, and I did a lot with Al, but the prisoners volunteered to be subjects. They believed they were volunteers. They volunteered to get malaria. They volunteered to take the drugs. And sorry, I've lost track of where I am. And Al became friendly, particularly with one of the prisoners, a man named Joseph DeSalvo. DeSalvo was not only a subject of the experiments, he was one of the men who got malaria and then got the drugs, but he was also a technician in the lab where the experiments were being run. And there's a pendulum of rehabilitation and punishment that has gone back and forth for the history of, well, probably all time, certainly of the US penal system. And at this moment, we were strongly in the direction of rehabilitation, that you gave prisoners not just time to think and contemplate what they had done wrong, but you gave them time to train to get out and do better, to train for a job. And the job that Joe DeSalvo was training for was to be a lab tech and a nurse. And he was learning to do that under Al's tutelage. He was good at the job. Al's saying for him was he had good hands on the glass, which was something that had been said of Al. And I learned along the way, starting with that story and then later on, that Al recognized himself in Joe. And one day, after they'd worked together for 2 years, Joe asked Al for help with the parole board. He was coming up for parole, and he thought that a good word from this doctor who had been training him would go a long way. Al not only spoke slowly, he researched everything meticulously, and he looked into not just Joe's request, but the history and the efficacy of parole, and determined that then, as now, the things that were thought to make a difference in someone succeeding on parole were a job when they got out, a place to live, and getting out of the water they swam in. So Al not only wrote a letter that said Joe would be a good candidate for parole, but he also got him a job in Norwalk, Connecticut, which was where Al himself was from, where he grew up. And he got him a place to live with family friends in an apartment above a garage. And he de facto got him out of Chicago, which is where Joe went bad, and to Connecticut for a new start. At first, things went very well for Joe. And then they went very badly. And at 10 p.m. on July 7th, 1960, Connecticut police officer named David Troy, next slide, was shot and killed. My stepfather spoke for 45 minutes or so over breakfast that morning. And when he finished, I said, "You know, I have to write about this, don't you?" "Well," he said, "if you must." And that was the beginning of the 10 years, clock started that day, that I spent researching everything I could possibly find about the moment that Joe's life and Al's life and David Troy's life intersected. The shooting of Officer David Troy on July 7th, 1960 was huge, huge news in Stamford. He was the first officer in the history of the city to be killed in the line of duty. Reading some of the coverage, I thought of 9/11. This was as big a deal to Stamford at that moment as 9/11 was in many ways. It was the beginning of, cops on corners holding out their hats to collect money for families, the same way that happened here in 9/11. The entire city came together to support the family and do what they could for these people they hadn't met, but who had suddenly made it clear that they no longer lived in a small, safe town where all their illusions of what they thought to be true were shattered. The arrest of Joseph DeSalvo, next slide, was on the front page of the Stamford Advocate every single day from July through December. Coverage of his arrest, coverage of his trial, stories of his family was front page news for all those months. So the first thing I did when he told me this story was I fact checked. It was a 50-year-old story at the time by a man who was nearly 90. And while he seemed very in control, I'm a reporter of many years. So I started with those news clippings that you looked at. They, verified the general facts of the story. I looked into the other parts as well. Next slide. The malaria trials, for instance, at Stateville were, voluminous records on what was done, including Al's role in that. So I could do a lot of fact checking on Al's piece of the story, but he was an expert. Next slide. He was an expert only on his piece of the story. And I had to look elsewhere for other parts of even his tale. What compelled me, I love this triptych. It's actually from the New York Times review of the book, which I also loved. And it's a reminder of what compelled me to this story from the start, these three pieces. When I said to him, I have to write about this, don't you? I had this image of three men. Times chose not to use the murderer, but rather the prison. But I had this image of these three men who were all the same age in 1960 when their paths crossed. They all began arguably at the same starting line, a starting line that I'm assuming if you're on this call, you know well, right? Three sons, grandsons of immigrants who were brought here because their families wanted to do better by their children, by these young men, so they could have a better life. And the guiding question of this story the whole time from day one was, how does one inheritor of the American dream become the cop, one become his killer, and one become my stepfather who inadvertently set this shooting into motion? Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backward, but it has to be lived forward. So I went backward. Meet the Tarlovs. Next slide. They were from Grodno, Poland. They escaped the pogroms and the Tsar in the 19th century, and they landed in Norwalk, Connecticut. This is Max Tarlov. He was the father of this whole clan of 10 children. He ran a business. You can see in the back, I'm sitting here using my cursor as if you can see it, and I'm just realizing that I'm not pointing at anything, so I'm sorry. But in the back to the right, you can see his stables. And he ran a business that kind of made him the Avis of Norwalk of 1906, which is when this photo was taken. He would go to the Badlands of South Dakota. He would go to the far west. He would find horses, wild horses. He had a knack for figuring out which horses could be best trained to pull buggies. And he would have them shipped, and then he essentially rented out buggies to families who could not afford their own. He also built the house that you see here, which one of my favorite facts is all the way in the back, and I'm not sure what size screen you're all looking on, but there is a little dollhouse, and that dollhouse is an exact replica of this house, of the big house. There's also an adorable dog, and it's the details like that, the first things I came across when I was meeting the Tarlovs, that made me understand them. I mean, here was a family where somebody took the time to make a replica of the house as a dollhouse for the children, where the family pet was in the photos. So this was sort of my guiding image of Al's family when they first came over here. Soon after this photo is taken, Max will get on a train to pick up a shipment of 26 horses. That train will be diverted because of an engine malfunction in another train on an entirely different route. And the diversion, which resulted from the small break, a tiny break in a little holes, and the diversion would mean that Max's train winds up on the wrong track, headed straight for yet another train that is also in the wrong place at the wrong time. Eyewitness accounts, next slide. There we go. Eyewitness accounts would describe it as two bucking stallions colliding with fury. 10 people would die, more than a dozen would be injured. Slide. Among the dead would be Max Tarlov. They got his name wrong, but there he is. Did I give you a close-up of that? I did not. But there he is, circled in red. They spelled his name wrong. And God bless local news reporters, right? I know what car Max was in. I know that his head was on his coat like a pillow when he fell asleep. What happened next was they brought his body home. They buried it in the cemetery of the synagogue he founded with, and left his wife to care for their 10 children, the ones in that photo. Shortly after the funeral, she got the family together and they all agreed that one of them would go to college, and that would be Isidore, the youngest, and Al's uncle eventually. And Isidore would go on to become a renowned neurosurgeon and Al Tarlovs' mentor. So, because of Isidore, Al became a doctor. And because Isidore was a socialist who took Al to a fundraiser for the American Communist Party, Al was thrown out of medical school in New York and landed at medical school at the much more liberal University of Chicago, where he was mentored in time by the man in charge of the malaria drug trials at Stateville. In other words, had a hose not broken on a distant train, then Al might never have been a doctor, might not have been stationed at the Stateville Penitentiary, might not have mentored Joe. Had a hose not broken on a Pennsylvania train in 1906, then police officer David Troy might not have died in July of 1960. It was that train of thought, that butterfly effect, that sliding doors that kept me researching and writing for these 10 years. It's an old theme. I didn't invent it. It's a mainstay of religion and philosophy and history and almost all great literature of your life, of mine. We all have a story. It's usually one about meeting our spouse, where we marvel at the countless things that had any one of them been different, everything would have been different. We all have these moments in our lives, but unless a dedicated genealogist or an unhinged conspiracist or an obsessed nonfiction author comes along, we don't know what those moments are. For the Tarlovs, the first stop in finding the trail was my stepfather. But then there are the other two families. Spoiler alert, slide. Joseph DeSalvo is dead. Can we do the next slide? He couldn't tell me his story. His only brother died months before he did. His parents, months afterwards. Different families leave different footprints. And this family's was mostly washed away. So finding the DeSalvos was very different than finding the Tarlovs. Next slide. First rule of journalism, FOIA everything. It took 6 years. I don't know if you can see the date, but I started looking in, I believe it was 2017 or 2018. And I finally got his prison files 6 years after, whenever that was. And so that was how I got to know Joseph DeSalvo, because there was no one left to speak for him. There was no one left to tell the kind of stories that the Tarlov family could tell me. Instead, I had things like the transcript of his parole hearing, where he explained that he was prepared for release into the world. I also found the man who hired him after he was released and who ran that lab at Norwalk Hospital, who Al contacted and recommended Joe for a job. And buried in that guy's files, like one of these stories about, the box in the back of the attic, and it was almost literally at the back of the attic. We found the letter that Joe himself wrote from prison after the shooting, trying to explain what the heck he just did. But we'll get to that. The rest was a scavenger hunt. It was all one tiny item at a time. For instance, his father had 9 siblings. They all had children who also had children. And I call this photo a jumble of DeSalvos. I found a few of them, a few of the descendants of the people in this photograph, mostly on Ancestry, leaving messages on accounts. And most of them had no interest in talking to me. They had never met this distant cousin. They heard a few stories. The few who did agree to talk to me gave me little crumbs, bits at a time. Joe's father, they all agreed, was the black sheep, the loser. He was abusive to his wife and his children, physically and emotionally. He was not right in the head. He made his wife, quote, clean his trophies every day, made his son sleep in a room filled with those trophies. And I thought, trophies? It turns out that Joe's father was a motorcycle star at a time when motorcycle racings had stars. It was the biggest sport in the United States between 1908 and 1911. News to me. I imagine news to you. There were glossy magazines. There were women waiting at the door, like at the stage door, but this was the arena door, offering handkerchiefs to the riders like Roman gladiators. They died like Roman gladiators too. There were no helmets. The machines occasionally barreled off into the crowds, taking out riders and spectators. The arenas built for the sport were called motordromes. They were dubbed murder dromes by the press because it was so dangerous. There were headlines like this one, or this one, or this one. And then came a race in 1911. It was the last race on the program. This is the program. And an article in the Janesville Daily Gazette on the obituary page, fittingly, discussed the crowd of 2,000 people who had come to this race in Janesville and how the day had been a huge success, except for one thing. There was a novelty race at the very end, and there were two racers in the race. One of them was Charles DeSalvos. And what he was to do was they went a mile around the track and they jumped off their bike and they drank a glass of lemonade and they jumped back on their bike, went another mile around the track. And Charles had drunk his lemonade, was heading back to his bike when his competitor, a local boy, came barreling at him at about 90 miles an hour. And rammed right into him, sent him up into the air and down onto the ground with a crack of his head that could be heard up in the stands. Today, we'd understand that an injury like this could cause a traumatic brain injury, that the personality changes that his family described after this accident, anger, inability to concentrate or hold a job, were symptoms of a TBI. That if he'd finished his lemonade seconds earlier and been back on his bike sooner, conceivably his sons might have been raised by a father who didn't beat and belittle them. If the father had been better able to hold a job, his son might not have accosted classmates for lunch money as early as third grade, or been sent to a home for incorrigible youth before he reached his teens. Might not have been at the Stateville Penitentiary when a new Army doctor arrived, one whose own life story inclined him to see redemption in people. If Joe's father had finished his lemonade sooner in 1911, might David Troy not have died in 1960? I found the Troy children on Facebook. This is the Facebook message I sent out of the blue. I'm told later that they all called each other and vetted me and Googled me and finally called their Uncle Dante, who it seems had happened to read another book of mine, and that's why they agreed to talk to me. They were eager to talk, but where Al had stories for me and Joe had a trail of documents a mile long, the Troy kids were hoping I would find stories for them. Their father had died when they were 4, 3, and 6 months. They were so young that they asked David's widow Rose, David's widow Rosie for a photo. Next slide. She realized they had never taken one of the 5 of them together. And so she had to cobble together a collage with 6-month-old David Troy Jr., sort of the the odd man out. These children, now adults in their 60s, had rarely asked their mother about their father. The subject, they say, always felt taboo. It was off limits. They also thought they would have plenty of time, but this family is cursed in many ways. And their mother died in a car accident in 2002. So they never had time to ask for those stories. Still, together, we found out a lot of things. Meet Rose and Jerome Cosentino. This is their mother's side of the story. In time, Rose and Jerome would become David Troy's mother-in-law and father-in-law when Dave married his wife, Rosie. The children of this marriage knew it was a tumultuous one, and the grandchildren knew it was a tumultuous one, but they did not know the whole of it. So if you think documents can't talk, take a look at this one. This is their marriage license. It was, I've seen quite a number of them by the time I finished this book, and this one was so different. It was applied for, let's look at the next slide. I think it shows it more closely. It was applied for in October of 1913. I could be wrong on my dates and I can't see this close enough, but it was applied for in October. And they were not married. Let's go even closer. Until July of the next year. Every marriage license I've seen, the bride and groom happily head off to get their license and get married the next day. These went kicking and screaming down the aisle. And then there's the paper trail that shows what happened afterwards. Here are a few of Jerome's convictions for public drunkenness in 1926, in 1931, in 1932. And then this is their divorce in 1937. So he left, as Rose Tarloff was left with 10 children, Rose Cosentino was also left with 10 children to raise and no income with which to do it. And finally, here is his death in a cab, in the cab of a truck in I don't have it here, where he had fallen asleep. He'd broken into it to warm up and fell asleep, and his cause of death is chronic alcoholism and exposure. So then there's Officer Troy's parents. And that's where Melanie McComb and American Ancestors comes in. I found his father fairly easily. He was born in the US. His parents' immigration and naturalization records were right where they should have been. But his mother, Bridget Riley Troy, she was a brick wall. And short version of what happened was I wanted to use their marriage license to confirm their parents' names, but I couldn't find a marriage license. And looking through census records for just a Bridget Riley was all but impossible. There were quite a number of them. And there was no Bridget Riley who came to the United States on any ship's manifest at about the time that Bridget Riley Troy was thought to have come. Melanie broke this wall. It was relatively simple, but also profound. She knew, among other things, to look for Delia, because Delia was an extraordinarily common nickname for Bridget, which she used until she got on that ship and never used again on this side of the ocean. I didn't put in the slide that shows that we found her. Melanie found her, born October 26th, 1898 in County Cavan, to Peter Riley and Annie McGlynn. So next problem, where and when was she married? I hadn't been able to find that marriage record anywhere. I knew that they were both practicing Catholics, that they met at church, and yet there was no record of their marriage in August of 1919, which is what the family Bible said they were married. There was nothing anywhere in the state of Connecticut, certainly nothing at the church that they attended in Stamford, Connecticut. So I broadened the dates, still nothing. And then I broadened the location, even though that made no sense. Why would they not marry at the church that was theirs, deeply theirs? But it was wartime, 1919. And Charles Troy was based on a ship off Brooklyn Harbor. And so maybe they got married there for convenience sake. And I looked I broadened the search to New York, and there they were. And let's look at the next slide. There they were in Manhattan at a church in Midtown. The names match. Charles Troy marrying Bridget Riley. We now know her mother's name and her father's name, and those match. I already knew Charles's mother's name and father's name, and those match. They were both from Stamford, Connecticut. But what were they doing in Midtown among strangers? Because the witnesses the census showed were employees of the church. You've probably figured it out by now, but I went and I looked at their oldest daughter's birth record, and she was not born, as the family Bible said, in 1921. She was born 3 months before her parents' marriage. And this was a secret until her death, and a secret until I gently reached out to the family and told them. And it explained a lot. It explained a lot of the bitterness and the disappointment and the general affect of this woman who they had known for so many years, but had not known something deeply important about. All of this took a while. It was exactly 10 years, as I said, from start to finish. And during those years, Al's memory, which had been razor sharp, which had checked out with everything I could check, it began to wane. We exchanged letters a lot at the beginning. I would send him a lot of questions. He would write back. He would write quickly. He would write in great detail. And then I noticed that I was asking him about incidents that he had given me in great detail, and it confused him. And that upset him. And I stopped asking. The pandemic really took its toll. God bless my mother, who kept him safe. It became her mission to keep him alive. But looking only at the face of one other human being isn't good for somebody whose mind is already slipping. And by the time the book came out, he read it as if it were someone else's life story. Someone who'd led an interesting life, but a story that he didn't know. The publication date of this book was May 28th of 2023. That was also the date of Al's funeral. We buried him near his grandfather in the same cemetery that his grandpa Max had built. And if he hadn't told me this story, it would have been gone. The dedication reads, "To Alvin R. Tarloff, thank you for entrusting me with your memories." Not trusting, entrusting. I wrote that. It was the last thing I wrote. It was the last thing I wrote before the pages were final. And it was because it was as if he handed them over to me, and they were now mine for safekeeping. They were now my responsibility. All we are in the end, those are stories. There were all sorts of events planned when the book came out, book parties and interviews and the things one does. And I thought of canceling them because it seemed, on the one hand, inappropriate to go off and hawk a book right after your beloved stepfather's funeral. But I decided to do it all because Al gave me a story and he told me to tell it. And so I did. And what I am urging in the telling is that we all tell the stories because that's what we have to offer the next generation, whatever knowledge there is in them, and the ability to pass down the past tells the future where it came from. So I'm particularly thrilled to speak to this particular audience because you're already the choir and the converted that I am preaching to. And thank you for having me to hear Al's story.
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Melanie McComb, and I'm your moderator for today's session. And I'm so excited to be talking to you about this book. It is absolutely wonderful, and it is so hard to put down just the level of detail you put in them. How would you describe this book to most people? You mentioned you've had the memories of your stepfather, but would you call this a family memoir book? Would you call it a true crime book? What would you classify it?
There's such a thing in publishing as a shelving problem. What shelf do you put the book on? And this book has a shelving problem. I don't care. I told a good story the way I wanted to tell it, but it's interesting to think of, what role does a story like this play? It is part true crime. It is about a crime. But traditionally, most crimes don't start with the writer telling you who did it and then figuring out the whole of why. I think it's a history book. I think it's a genealogy book. The title is on purpose, right? The word genealogy is in there. It's excavating everything that had to happen for a something to happen. And we could write this book, but I could write it about how you and I ended up on this screen together. There might not be a murder. I hope there wouldn't be a murder. But, just the coincidences and the chances and the historic events and all the things that had to happen before the one thing could happen. So I think it's history and genealogy. That's what I think I wrote. That was the part I enjoy the most about it.
Yeah, and speaking of history, there obviously were so many topics as you mentioned, including the motor drones, the military service, the immigration stories. I mean, you cover and the prison reform, the malaria studies. I mean, there's so many different topics that are covered with this. Did you know that it was going to turn into that, with going into all these different areas, or did it kind of just envelop with the story?
I am not a woo-woo person, Melanie. I really am not. But there were times where I truly felt, that these people had been sitting there for 100 years, waiting for me to show up and figure out what part they played in this jigsaw. So I started with what I thought was an interesting tale of a dilemma that my stepfather had back in 1960. But all I had was the 1960 part. And so I started looking backwards. And everything seemed to connect to this tale in 1960. For instance, one of the earliest stories in the book is about a fire in a prison in 1915. It's the precursor to Stateville, the Joliet Penitentiary, which looks like a haunted castle. And the woman killed in this fire was the warden's wife. The warden and his wife lived in the castle. And I'm reading about the general history of the Joliet Penitentiary, And I come across this story, and the man accused of setting the fire and killing her was a trustee, right? A prisoner who had particular trust of the warden and did domestic service in the turret of this castle where the warden's family lived. And his main defense was, I couldn't have done it. She said she was going to write a letter to the parole board to get me out of here, right? She trusted me. She was going to write a letter to the parole board. And then, if you believe the story, and I'm not so sure that guy did it, frankly, but that's another thing, the person who was trusted with a letter to the parole board went on to commit a murder. This is 1915. And then, I'm writing a story about the same thing in 1960. There are just, and as it happened, the warden was a real progressive and believed in things like trustees. And his progressive prison reform was set back a generation because of this death, and likely affected the rules when Joe DeSalvo was released, right? So it all just kind of proves to be connected. Can I use one more example of someone who stood up and waved at me? Leopold and Loeb are not in my book proposal. Leopold and Loeb were a big part of this book. Why? Because I knew that I was going to have to find out more about how Stateville operated in the late 1950s, early 1960s, because that's when Joe and Al were there. So I started to read books about Stateville during that period of time. And the most famous prisoner in the history of Stateville was Nathan Leopold, who wrote an autobiography about his time in the Stateville Penitentiary, overlapping these years. So I'm sitting there reading his autobiography, and I get to the part where bored Nathan Leopold starts to basically invent a system by which to predict whether or not a paroled convict will recidivate, will commit another crime and come back, right? He reinvented the parole system based on his hunches as to whether people who were leaving would come back. And he had 99 years to sit there and wait and see if they did. So the questionnaire that Joe filled out, that the parole board read and used to determine whether or not Joe got parole, and that Al trusted because he thought this was authoritative and they must know because they used this to determine parole. That questionnaire was done by Nathan Leopold, right? The most notorious murderer in the history of the United States, depending which screaming headline you read. So no, I knew none of this, but I would just sit there with my weird murder board, with the, I didn't actually have string, but it was
all the
kind
strings,
of like
right?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Strings
It kind of felt like that. And so the idea that we have no idea what's out there, but we've all got stuff like that. We just don't know it. So no, I had no idea. And that's why it took 10 years. And I ended up cutting 70,000 words from the first draft of the manuscript. 70,000 words is a book. For those who've never written one, 70,000 words is a book. And I ended up cutting 70,000 words from the manuscript because there was just so much. And there's only so much I could ask you guys to read. I mean, come on.
Well, it was absolutely fascinating, especially when you consider all the themes in there about, redemption, second chances. Could the reform actually come about? And like you said, you mirrored that with, the murder of Odetta Allen, the warden's wife, with, with what happened with David Troy, and just seeing was Joe DeSalvo almost like the epitome of what happens when you trust the prisoner. This comes too close, with the words of Clarence Darrow echoing, throughout the time of all the wardens, to say you see, Nathan Leopold eventually gets paroled and he goes on and is a civil citizen and goes to Puerto Rico.
So
and it's fine.
what do you think is statistically the category of prisoner least likely to recidivate? I'm still not sure if that's a word, even though I use it all the time lately.
Like, again, I mean, it seemed like
Well,
it was like
you know the answer, right?
yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah. I mean, it seems like the ones that had the best support system and with their family were
Oh,
less
oh
likely
yes. No,
to
no, absolutely. And yet DeSalvo had all of that. He was
all
given
of that,
all
but it
of that.
wasn't enough.
But
It was still not enough.
think about the crime. So the people we are the most afraid of, right? We are afraid of the murderers. We are so, and don't let them out. And Nathan Leopold, I track how people fought his release for far longer than they would have had he not made headlines. But because he was an evil, terrible, awful killer, and we don't want him out on the streets. And yet, the category of crime least likely to be repeated is murder. Which, if you flip that sentence, the most trustworthy convict is a murderer.
Yeah.
The one who's most likely to repeat is armed robbery. Because one is a way of life and the other is very specific circumstances. Murderers just most of the time don't just go around murdering because it's a thing they do every day. Whereas armed robbery, that's what it becomes. And so, in a way, DeSalvo never had a chance. But the system also spends a lot of time worrying about the wrong things or correcting for the wrong things.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, and like you said, even though he had that family structure and everything too, but had his father not had a traumatic brain injury and this adrenaline rush of, the motorcycles, like had that set in motion, his fate. And I think that was kind of a question in there too, of there, like, was this nature versus nurture? Like, could you learn to be a better person, or were you a circumstance of, your conditions or all around you and your family and your economic status, and to see if that was enough. And it seemed like that there's just little bits of like I said, the butterfly effect. You could see like little things could have just changed it. Just one small thing would have changed a whole circumstance, and possibly decades later of a horrible crime.
Yeah, and for a long time I didn't like the moral of my own book, right? The moral of the story. And I struggled with that because you have Joseph DeSalvo, who arguably was just a no good human being or a guy who never had a chance. But either way, there was no happy ending for him. Right? There was almost an inevitability of this. And that's why Dante Cosentino is in this book. So there's a character named Dante Cosentino who is Rose Cosentino Troyes, the wife of David Troy, his brother, and you see them growing up together. And Dante also has a horrific childhood. He also has a father who deserts him. That would be Jerome, the drunk, who we just saw. Father who deserts him, who beats him, who abuses the family. I mean, could have turned out to be Joe DeSalvo, but he doesn't. And the why there is the moral I've decided is the moral of the book. The fact that he didn't was because people stepped in early for him in a way that they didn't for Joe. And almost too on the nose, Dante actually takes a psychology class on the GI Bill when he finally gets to go to college. And his psychology professor said, what's the difference between a young man who does well and a young man who falls apart? And it's someone who cared about him before the age of 7. And it means that you can, or we as a society can, or life can step in and help sometimes, but it has to be early and it has to be, focused. But at least there there was hope, and at least I didn't end up with nobody had a chance. Everything was inevitable. They were all going to die. Because I didn't want to write a book with no hope.
Right. Yeah, and it seemed like hope was obviously something that was, being held onto for a lot of ways, even whether it's just the immigrant dream, like you said, the starting line about they all started about the same circumstances, coming over and growing up in the Great Depression, and then making their way through the world, and everyone chose their different paths. But obviously, each path had a different circumstance. Do you think your stepfather ever wondered what would have happened if he had not been forced to go to medical school out in the Midwest and was able to pursue, going to medical school where he was without being accused of being a communist?
Yeah, Al was a very matter-of-fact science person. I mean, it's interesting. You have three characters, and Al believes in science, and David Troy believed in fate, and Joe didn't believe in anything in the end, right? He had lost all belief in anything. But Al looked at everything very scientifically and did not spend a lot of time on what ifs. He was a little confused by what I was doing, and I don't mean when he was starting to go deep into dementia. I mean, when I kept asking him all these questions about his childhood, and he's like, but aren't you writing about, the history of prisons and my views of prison reform? And I was like, no, I'll get to that. But please tell me all about your childhood and your relationship with your Uncle Isidore. So I don't think he spent a lot of time on that. I think he knew, though, that there were moments that completely changed his life, and you don't know which those moments are until you look back on them. So for him, yes, he knew that he was going from one medical school to the other. He saw it as something scary. He saw it as a loss. Saw it a little bit as a course correction because he didn't understand why I didn't get into Chicago in the first place. But he did not see it as, oh my God, the entire world is now going to change because I have to, right? We don't tend to do that. Or the moments we think are the life-changing ones don't necessarily turn out to be. So I don't think he experienced his life that way. I think you can go crazy if you spend all your time trying to predict what each decision in your life is going to lead to.
And what does this make you think about, like, what an immigrant's chance in America was at this time? I mean, it seemed like the role of religion was definitely a very driving force for them, whether they were Jewish or they were Catholic. Um, you know, what kind of themes were you kind of getting when you're kind of thinking about what chance they had to
Well,
make it through this
it's
world, and
interesting
and get the American dream?
because I wrote all of this when there were echoes of all these themes going on in the real world. Immigration being the hugely obvious one. I mean, the things that were being debated in 1924 when the door clanged shut on a lot of these people, but they happened to be here already, are the same things that we're debating right now. The idea of, each group wanting a group they can look down on, which just seems to be part of American history. Bridget Troy was very proud to be Irish. She knew there were people who looked down on her because she was Irish. She was there during the No Irish Need Apply signs. But she also worked for women who had been there 20, 30 years longer than she had, Irish women who only wanted to hire recent Irish immigrants because they weren't Italian. And, those Italians are dirty. So that was fascinating, that we still have this feeling that, yes, we're all immigrants, but some of us are going to look down on other of us. I also, remember I was writing about the 1918 pandemic, for instance, in 2020.
Yeah.
The whole idea, I sort of developed this image of the sepia toned people, right? We're used to looking at old photographs and we're kind of paternalistic about it. We're slightly patronizing, look at those sepia toned people. Look what they didn't know. Oh my goodness, they had a pandemic. Well, aren't we lucky we have modern medicine? So, that wouldn't happen to us. Or they were all sewing bandages for the troops in World War I, and all these ladies sitting and sewing bandages. And then suddenly we were sewing masks.
Yeah.
We were talking about ivermectin as we did not know what to do with this medical crisis, even though we thought we were running out of ventilators. And we were the sepia-toned people, right? We think of ourselves as so different, but history is only history when the movie reels fade. When we start to think, oh, it looked different then. It didn't look different then, and it didn't feel different then. And writing this during the moments I was writing it was a real education, and that was me. And we need to respect that more in our society. We need to learn more from what those who preceded us went through.
Absolutely. Yeah, history definitely does repeat. And obviously other things keep coming up though was, all these secrets that you keep uncovering amongst all the history and the lines is that, you keep uncovering, like you said, the marriage where they were, clearly she was, pregnant every time. So how did you handle like dealing with some of these secrets and how to know which ones to tell and which ones not to and the way to tell it?
Bridget Troy's pregnancy is still reverberating in her family right now. The death of David Troy led to a fracture of sorts in the family. Rosie picked up their kids, and moved to California for two reasons. One, because they were becoming famous in Stanford, and people would point, they were the Troy kids, and the oldest in particular liked it a little bit too much, and her mom just wanted to get them out of there so that they could live a normal life. But also she had a huge fight with her mother-in-law, with Bridget, over the money that was collected from all of these fundraisers, all of these events for the family. And that was how all of the other grandchildren who were not David Troy's kids, that's how all of Bridget's other grandchildren were brought up to think of David's kids. So as adults, there's still animosity. They've gotten back together, they've had reunions, they all spoke to me, but they still look at each other warily in a lot of ways. And so when I sent them the pages, which I did not want them to find these things out when it was in hardcovers, but I sent them the pages about the marriage certificate, and they asked to speak to me because I'd made a huge mistake and they wanted to tell me about it. And we got on a Zoom call, and they first said, well, why are you lying about my grandmother? And I said, I don't believe I'm lying about your grandmother, but please tell me what you mean. He said, well, that isn't her birth certificate, that her marriage certificate can't be her marriage certificate. We were on a Zoom call. I pulled it up on the screen. They looked at it and were very quiet because it was clearly her marriage certificate. And one of them said, well, why did you have to tell everyone? Why did you have to tell the whole world? Right? So it's not just that this was a secret. It's a secret that was then put in a book. It was a secret that they felt their grandmother wanted kept. And why was I telling everyone? And I will tell you, Melanie, I still am not completely sure of the answer to that question, except I believe that truth is always better. I believe that an understanding of what this woman went through informs everything she did. If you know this piece of information, it made me so much more sympathetic to her. I think it shows how times have changed. It shows what it meant to be a woman at that time with very little agency or control and sort of hiding for her entire life. But also, I'm a journalist. I focus on a story. I deem a story important to tell, and I think this one legitimately was on so many levels. And then I tell it the best I can and as factually as I can. But it was not my favorite reporting moments. I think we ended up okay. Me and those kids who are not kids anymore. They're definitely adults in their 60s, 70s, and older. I think we ended up okay, but it is a responsibility to dig up the past. It is a burden of sorts.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in my line of work though, it's, what kind of advice would you give to genealogists that might want to uncover this kind of social history about their ancestors, and how to go about it with having some, like you said, discretion about these kind of secrets or things that will come up, and how to deal with living people as well?
Yeah, and it's interesting, the long tail of the past, right? That it still mattered to these people I mean, Bridget has been dead since 1980, the 1980s. I could not hurt her. And yet it mattered so much. Something that does not matter now mattered so much to her surviving relatives. I think you can't go into genealogy without knowing that there is a possibility that you are going to learn that something you thought was true of who you are and where you come from is not. That is the reason a lot of us do go into it, is to find out what we have been told is true and what is, exaggeration or misunderstanding or just plain false. It's the risk with genetic testing. I mean, there's every day there's a story about someone who finds out that what they thought they were is not what they are. And, a Christmas present upends an entire family. That is something that was not a risk until really recently. And now it is. Now it's not just a lot of dry documents. Now there is a lot more potential with genetics to say, not so much what you thought, but let's explore what the truth is. And I guess I've been a reporter for 40 years because I believe the truth is always better, that I believe knowing what really happened is better than a nice, tidy story that isn't true.
So how did you approach it differently from your job as a journalist, so to kind of separate it out?
Well, given the times I was writing during, I kept saying, I want to be back in 1918, right? With the election of 2016, the pandemic of 2020, I just kept saying, I want to be back in 1918. I know how that ends. We don't know how journalistically, you don't know the ending. That's the point. It is a first draft of history. You don't have anything that approaches a definitive answer. When you're covering the past, which this is the first time I've done, there is the luxury in some ways. You can't find everything. Some facts are unknown to you, but that's true of the present too. I found I really liked being in the past where there was closure. There was an end. So I guess that's not a difference in how I did it as much as it's a difference in how it felt to do it. And it's
Oh, that
something
makes sense. You
that
you
I've,
kind of centered more in the
yeah,
past than just the present.
and it's something I
Um,
really enjoy doing. My next one will be a book of history too. I like it back there.
what are you going to cover in that one next? You said covering
Um,
history.
it's not entirely clear, but I believe it is about the 1930s and women who just walked out of their lives and disappeared.
Hmm,
Give me 10 years.
interesting.
I'll give you a book.
Well, we can't wait to find out what happens next. I mean, you give us so much valuable insights on this, and I know that I think we all learned a lot about your process and how much love was really put into this book to really give it justice to what happened. Thank you, and I'll bring Margaret back into our conversation here.
I am so glad to have overheard this conversation, and Lisa, I'm really glad that you took a foray into the past. It's really helpful for all of us to learn exactly how you created this book, as many of us on this call are trying to build family stories for our own purposes from records and archives. And I loved seeing your archives. And Melanie, thank you so much for the work you did tonight, and also even more so in 2019. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Lisa to do a final reading from the book. And I think you've got two different spots.
I do. Two short spots, one from the beginning and one from the end. And the beginning is in the prologue, sort of with me discussing how I came to write this and sort of the realization of the role of history and the difference in covering history than in doing journalism. So very briefly, history divides neatly into chapters only in retrospect. In real time, we experience it as a jumble, a hurtling through the darkness by the light of an inadequate lamp. Our lives are prologue to one version of a story, an epilogue to another. We don't get the all of it, or even the more of it, unless a family historian or a fervent genealogist or a somewhat obsessed author comes along to map the whole. One day closer to whatever comes next, my family and I would toast at dinner each night during most of 2020. I wrote this book in the same spirit, telling the tale as it was lived. The people in the early chapters are the forebears of the people in the later ones, but they don't know that yet, might never know. At the start, they have no idea that a train crash in Altoona, a motorcycle race in Chicago, or a blazing fire in a prison tower in Joliet will start a cascade that will set the stage for a police officer's death. They can't know which family will eventually create the cop, which his killer, which my stepfather. They could not know how some doors were closed to some children even before they were born. Each one of us has a similar story in which we will never be certain of what part we play. We shape history even as we are shaped by it. We owe thanks and blame to our ancestors and an explanation and apology to our descendants. We are actors without a script, travelers without a map, gamblers who don't know the odds. We have less influence over who we are now than we believe, and much more power over the future than we think. And then just to end, a bit of explanation. What happened at the very end of, after Al wrote his letter to the parole board and Joe came to Norwalk and was doing well, Al spoke to him briefly when he was in Norwalk on vacation. Joe kept saying, I need to see you. I need to see you. Al said, I can't see you now. His wife was in health trouble and Al needed to turn his attention to Joe. And he said, I'm leaving for a few days. I will be back. I will see you then. So that's what you need to know to understand this. Decades also collided the day I brought Al to meet David Troy's children. One summer afternoon, we drove up to Norwalk, where Doreen and David and their families had gathered at Diane's house. What Dave's descendants most wanted to know was something Al could not tell them. He had never met David Troy. He could not fill in the gaps of what their father had been like. But they also wanted to learn about Joseph DeSalvo. What had made Al trust him? Then what had made Al suspect him? Al wanted to know about their lives too, ones he had completely changed. The time neared for us to leave, and as we started saying our goodbyes, Al raised his hand like a schoolboy with a question. May I say one more thing? He asked. I just want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain you've suffered because of an action of mine. What would you have done differently? One of Dave's grandchildren asked. If I had to do it all over again, I would still write the parole letter because I made the best choice I could with the information I had, Al said. What I would have done differently was I would have gone to see DeSalvo when he called. Joe had been struggling with his freedom and needed an anchor, Al said. Maybe if I had seen him, talked to him, reminded him of who he could be, he wouldn't have bought the gun. He took a deep breath. I realize it's likely he may have bought another gun, another day, held up another place, and shot another person. In fact, that's very likely. But it would not have been that day, and it would not have been your father.
Thank you, Lisa, for introducing us to these families and to these heartbreaking stories. Your 10 years of work, bringing these people nearly 10 years to life, is really so helpful and so interesting to all of us, especially your own family members. Really grateful. A reminder to our audience that copies of Genealogy of a Murder are available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. If you purchase the bundled ticket package for this evening, a signed copy of the book will be shipped to you from them by February 15. If you signed up simply for the Zoom event and would like to order a signed copy, you can buy it, or you want to buy additional copies, you can do that directly from the bookstore. The link is being shared in the chat. Please input the code AMINS24 so the staff knows to send you the right version. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have co-presented tonight's book talk with Porter Square Books. I also want to thank the Princeton Alumni Association of New England. If you're researching a time, a person, or a family, my colleagues are here to help. People like Melanie, staff members in the Education and Programming Department. All of us are here free to the public. You can chat with our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs providing skills for family historians. You can see on screen that we provide intelligence and direction on all sorts of family history topics, from DNA research to family history writing to the intricacies of Irish land records. Our mission in all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, book lovers and readers, we hope you'll join us for more author talks ahead. Next week, in honor of our first U.S. president's birthday, we've joined in partnership with Massachusetts Historical Society to bring you Cassandra Good and her book, First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. That's on Thursday, February 15. On February 26, we'll host Ilian Wu with her new book, heralded by the New York Times as one of the top 10 of last year, Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom. This is a remarkable true story of Ellen and William Craft, who escaped slavery through daring and disguise. Our guest author will be in discussion with a descendant of the Craft family, which is really quite remarkable, their first event together. On March 7, we'll hear from journalist and Professor Brooke Kroger about Undaunted, How Women Changed American Journalism. In an illustrated presentation, she'll take us from the time of Margaret Fuller to the investigative triumphs of Ida B. Wells to the influence of Joan Didion and Cokie Roberts. And we should also say Lisa Belkin, our very own journalist tonight. All this history before joining in conversation with Tracy Lucht, president of the American Journalism Historians Association. But back to tonight. Thank you, Lisa Belkin. Thank you for
so much. It was a pleasure.
Us for us too. And thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Kelly Nagel behind the scenes. I already thanked our partners. And most particularly, thank you to the audience out there in Zoomland. Our biggest thanks to you. We all appreciate your interest in America's history, in the truth, in all its diversity, America, all of its families. We hope to see you soon again. And for now, a good night to all. Lisa, we'll do it again. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much.